When my Uncle Richard stood up during the most sacred moment of our wedding ceremony at the historic St. Catherine's Chapel, interrupting the officiant's solemn recitation of the traditional vows that David and I had been dreaming of exchanging for the past 18 months of careful planning and excited anticipation, his voice cutting through the hushed reverence of 200 guests who had gathered to witness what should have been the happiest day of my life, as I promised to love and honor the man who had captured my heart with his kindness, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to building a future together based on honesty and mutual respect. I initially thought he was having some kind of medical emergency or emotional breakdown that required immediate attention and assistance from family members who could help him return to his seat without further disrupting the ceremony that had already been delayed by rain and last-minute vendor complications that had tested our patience and organizational abilities throughout the morning preparations. Instead of the confused rambling or health crisis that I had expected, Uncle Richard's clear and deliberate declaration, "She's not who you think," sent shockwaves through the assembled congregation, while my new husband David's face went completely white as the wedding ring he had been holding slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the marble floor of the altar with a metallic sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence that had fallen over a sanctuary that moments before had been filled with the joyful anticipation of family and friends who were celebrating the union of two people they believed were perfect for each other and destined for a lifetime of happiness together. The confusion and terror that I felt in that moment was nothing compared to the dawning realization that Uncle Richard's dramatic interruption was not random or accidental, but was instead a calculated revelation of information that he believed David needed to know before legally binding himself to someone whose true identity and background were apparently very different from what he had been led to believe throughout our relationship that had seemed built on a foundation of honesty, transparency, and shared values that had made us both confident that we were making the right decision in choosing each other as life partners and companions for whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. What my uncle revealed in the devastating conversation that followed would not only destroy my wedding day and my relationship with the man I loved, but would also expose a web of lies, stolen identity, and elaborate deception that had been created by desperate circumstances and maintained through years of careful performance that had required me to live as someone I wasn't, while hiding the truth about past trauma and survival choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but had ultimately created a false foundation for every relationship and achievement that had defined my adult life, until this moment when everything was about to collapse under the weight of secrets that could no longer be contained. The wedding ceremony that had been interrupted by Uncle Richard's shocking revelation had been planned as a perfect celebration of love and commitment that would honor both our personal preferences and the traditions that were important to our families, with careful attention to every detail from the flowers and music to the menu and decorations that would create lasting memories for everyone who participated in this milestone event that marked not just the beginning of our marriage, but also the culmination of months of planning, preparation, and excited anticipation that had brought together relatives and friends from across the country to witness our exchange of vows and celebrate the love that had grown between us over 3 years of dating, engagement, and building the kind of relationship that seemed destined to last a lifetime. The chapel where we had chosen to hold our ceremony was a historic stone building with stunning stained glass windows and Gothic architecture that provided the perfect backdrop for the elegant and traditional wedding that we had envisioned, with white roses and baby's breath arranged in elaborate displays that created a romantic atmosphere while honoring the sacred nature of the promises we were making to each other and to the community of family and friends who were serving as witnesses to our commitment and supporters of our future happiness and success as a married couple. The guest list for our wedding had included both sides of our families, along with close friends from college, graduate school, and our respective careers that had brought us together at a medical conference where David had been presenting research on cardiovascular surgery techniques, while I had been attending as a pharmaceutical sales representative who specialized in cardiac medications and devices that were revolutionizing treatment options for patients with complex heart conditions that required the kind of innovative approaches and cutting-edge technology that David's work was helping to develop and implement in hospitals throughout the region. Our relationship had developed gradually from professional acquaintanceship to personal friendship, and eventually into the deep romantic love that had convinced us both that we had found our life partners and soulmates who would support each other's career goals and personal growth while building a family and creating the kind of stable and loving home environment that would provide security and happiness for whatever children we might be blessed to have together in the future years of our marriage. The morning of our wedding had begun with the kind of nervous excitement and joyful anticipation that characterized such milestone events, with bridesmaids and family members gathering in the bridal suite of the luxury hotel, where we had reserved rooms for out-of-town guests, while I underwent the professional hair and makeup styling that would transform me into the radiant bride that David deserved, and that would create the perfect appearance for the photographs and memories that would document this special day for the rest of our lives. The wedding dress that I had chosen after months of shopping and careful consideration was a stunning creation of silk and lace that had been altered to fit perfectly, and that made me feel beautiful and confident as I prepared to walk down the aisle toward the man who had proven his love and commitment through countless gestures of kindness, support, and partnership that had convinced me that I had found someone who truly understood and accepted me for who I was beneath the carefully maintained professional persona that had been necessary for success in the competitive pharmaceutical industry, where reputation and credibility were essential for building client relationships and achieving sales targets. The identity that I had been living under for the past 8 years was not actually my own, but belonged to someone else whose social security number, educational credentials, and employment history I had assumed after fleeing an abusive situation that had left me with no resources, no family support, and no legal options for protecting myself from someone who had threatened to destroy my life and career if I ever tried to leave or expose the criminal activities that had characterized our relationship and the business operations that he controlled through intimidation and violence that had made me fear for my physical safety and future well-being. The real Sarah Elizabeth Morgan, whose identity I had stolen, was a woman who had died in a car accident in another state just days after graduating from pharmacy school, with the credentials and qualifications that had enabled me to create a new life and career that provided financial security and professional respect, while keeping me hidden from the dangerous people who had been searching for me under my real name and identity that had been compromised by my association with criminal activities that I had never willingly participated in, but that had made me a liability and potential witness who needed to be silenced permanently. The pharmaceutical sales career that had provided the foundation for my new identity and lifestyle had been built entirely on stolen credentials and falsified employment records that had been created through careful research and identity theft that had allowed me to assume the educational background and professional qualifications that were necessary for success in an industry that required specialized knowledge and technical expertise that I had acquired through intensive self-study and on-the-job learning that had enabled me to perform effectively, despite lacking the formal education and legitimate credentials that my employers and clients believed I possessed. The success that I had achieved in this career had been genuine in terms of sales performance and client satisfaction, but it had all been built on a foundation of deception and fraud that had required constant vigilance and careful management of information to prevent discovery of the truth about my background and qualifications that would have resulted in immediate termination and potential criminal prosecution for identity theft and fraud that could have sent me to prison while also exposing me to the dangerous people I had been hiding from for nearly a decade. The relationship with David had been the first genuine emotional connection I had experienced since assuming my false identity, creating internal conflict between my desire for authentic love and intimacy and my need to maintain the deception that protected both my physical safety and my professional reputation that had taken years to establish and that provided the financial security and social standing that had made my new life possible. The love that had developed between us had been real and transformative, giving me hope that I might be able to build a future based on genuine connection and mutual support, rather than the isolation and constant fear that had characterized my existence since fleeing my previous life, and assuming someone else's identity to survive and create opportunities for advancement and happiness that had seemed impossible under my real name and circumstances. The decision to marry David without revealing the truth about my identity and background had been the most difficult and morally complicated choice of my adult life, involving the recognition that our marriage would be based on fundamental deception that could destroy our relationship if the truth was ever discovered, while also acknowledging that revealing my real identity could put both of us in danger from people who had been searching for me and who had demonstrated their willingness to use violence and intimidation to protect their criminal enterprises and eliminate potential threats to their operations and freedom. The legal implications of marrying under a false identity had been another source of anxiety and moral uncertainty, as I understood that the marriage license and ceremony would be based on fraudulent information that could invalidate our legal union, while also creating additional criminal liability for fraud and perjury that could result in prosecution and imprisonment if the deception was ever discovered by law enforcement or government agencies. The background investigation that Uncle Richard had apparently conducted in preparation for our wedding had revealed discrepancies and inconsistencies in my claimed personal history that had raised questions about my identity and credentials that he had pursued through private investigators and document verification services that had ultimately uncovered the truth about the identity theft and fraud that had enabled me to create my new life and career in pharmaceutical sales. The timing of his revelation during our wedding ceremony had been calculated to cause maximum disruption and humiliation, while also ensuring that David learned the truth before legally committing to a marriage that was based on fundamental deception about my identity, background, and qualifications that had shaped every aspect of our relationship and future planning. The specific details that Uncle Richard revealed to the assembled wedding guests included documentation of my real name, criminal associations from my previous life, and evidence of the identity theft that had enabled me to assume Sarah Morgan's credentials and build a career in pharmaceutical sales, despite lacking the education and qualifications that my employers and clients believed I possessed. The revelation that I was actually Jessica Martinez, a former associate of drug dealers and money launderers who had fled criminal prosecution and assumed a dead woman's identity to escape retribution and legal consequences, created immediate chaos and confusion among wedding guests who were struggling to understand how someone they had known and trusted for years could have been living such an elaborate lie while building relationships and professional success based on stolen credentials and falsified background information. The reaction from David when he learned the truth about my identity and background was immediate and devastating, involving not just shock and disbelief about the deception, but also anger and hurt about the betrayal of trust that had characterized our entire relationship from the moment we had first met at the medical conference, where I had been representing myself as someone with legitimate pharmaceutical credentials and educational background that had never actually belonged to me. The realization that every conversation about our future together had been based on lies about my past and qualifications created a sense of betrayal that went beyond typical relationship dishonesty into territory that involved fundamental questions about my character and the authenticity of the love and commitment that I had claimed to feel for him throughout our courtship and engagement. The immediate consequences of Uncle Richard's revelation included the obvious cancellation of our wedding ceremony and reception, along with the humiliating task of explaining to 200 guests why the celebration was ending before the vows had been completed and the marriage had been legally established through the exchange of rings and official documentation that would have created legal obligations and rights that were now impossible given the fraudulent nature of my identity and the criminal implications of marrying under false pretenses that could have created additional legal complications for both David and myself if the ceremony had been allowed to continue. The legal ramifications of the exposed identity theft began immediately as law enforcement officials who had been contacted by Uncle Richard's private investigators arrived at the chapel to arrest me on charges of identity theft, fraud, and related crimes that had been committed over the course of nearly 8 years of living under someone else's name and credentials, while building a career and personal relationships based on stolen identity documents and falsified employment records that had enabled me to achieve success and social standing that would have been impossible under my real name and circumstances. The investigation that followed my arrest revealed the full extent of the identity theft and fraud that had been necessary to maintain my false identity, including forged educational transcripts, falsified employment verification, and coordinated deception that had required constant vigilance and careful management of information to prevent discovery of inconsistencies or contradictions that might have exposed the truth about my background and qualifications that had been entirely fabricated, based on someone else's legitimate achievements and credentials. The criminal prosecution that resulted from the investigation involved multiple charges related to identity theft, fraud, perjury, and conspiracy that reflected not only the original theft of Sarah Morgan's identity, but also the ongoing deception and false documentation that had been necessary to maintain the fraud over years of employment and personal relationships that had been built on false foundations of trust and authenticity that had been completely undermined by the revelation of my true identity and criminal background. The personal consequences of the exposure included not only the loss of my relationship with David and the destruction of our wedding day, but also the collapse of my entire professional and social life that had been built around the false identity that had provided opportunities and relationships that were now impossible to maintain once the truth about my background and qualifications had been revealed to employers, clients, friends, and family members who felt betrayed and deceived by someone they had trusted and respected based on completely false information about my character and credentials. The aftermath of Uncle Richard's revelation required extensive legal representation and plea negotiations to address the criminal charges while also dealing with civil lawsuits from employers and clients who had suffered financial losses as a result of trusting someone whose qualifications and credentials had been entirely fraudulent, creating liability for damages that extended far beyond the immediate consequences of identity theft into areas of professional malpractice and breach of fiduciary duty that had serious financial and legal implications for my future. The prison sentence that resulted from my conviction on multiple counts of identity theft and fraud provided time for reflection and rehabilitation that helped me understand the full impact of my choices and the harm that had been caused to innocent people who had trusted me based on false information about my identity and qualifications, while also giving me opportunities to develop legitimate skills and education that would enable me to rebuild my life based on authentic achievements and genuine credentials rather than stolen identity and fraudulent documentation. The relationship with David was permanently destroyed by the revelation of my deception and criminal background, as he was unable to forgive or forget the betrayal of trust that had characterized our entire relationship from the beginning, despite my genuine love for him and my regret about the choices that had made our relationship impossible to continue, based on the fundamental dishonesty that had shaped every aspect of our connection and future planning. The family relationships that had been damaged by my deception required years of rebuilding trust and demonstrating through consistent behavior and authentic achievements that I had learned from my mistakes and was committed to living honestly and transparently, rather than maintaining the elaborate deceptions that had characterized my adult life for nearly a decade of stolen identity and fraudulent professional success. Today, 5 years after Uncle Richard stood up at my wedding and revealed that I wasn't who David thought I was, causing my husband to drop his ring as our entire relationship collapsed under the weight of exposed deception, I have completed my prison sentence and am rebuilding my life based on my real identity and legitimate achievements that have been earned through honest work and authentic relationships that are built on truth rather than the elaborate lies that had previously defined my existence and shaped my understanding of what was necessary for survival and success in a world that had seemed hostile and dangerous. The lesson that emerged from this devastating experience is that deception, no matter how necessary it might seem for survival or advancement, ultimately creates more problems and pain than the original circumstances it was designed to address, and that authentic relationships and genuine success can only be built on foundations of honesty and truth that allow people to know and accept each other completely, rather than loving false personas that conceal fundamental realities about identity and character. The decision to assume someone else's identity had been motivated by genuine fear and desperate circumstances that had made survival seem impossible under my real name, but the long-term consequences of that choice had created a prison of deception that had prevented authentic relationships and genuine happiness, while also creating legal and moral obligations that had ultimately led to far worse consequences than those I had been trying to avoid through identity theft and fraud. Looking back on that moment when Uncle Richard revealed my true identity and David dropped his wedding ring as our entire future together collapsed in front of 200 wedding guests, I understand that while the exposure was initially devastating and humiliating, it ultimately provided opportunities for authentic living and genuine relationships that would never have been possible as long as I continued to live as someone I wasn't, while hiding fundamental truths about my background and the choices that had shaped my adult life and character development. Was I wrong to assume a false identity to escape dangerous circumstances and build a new life? Or were my survival choices understandable given the threats and limited options that had been available to me at the time? Should I have revealed the truth about my identity to David before we became seriously involved, even if that disclosure might have put both of us in danger from people who were still searching for me? Would you have made the same choice to expose such deception at a wedding ceremony? Or should Uncle Richard have found a more private way to share information that would inevitably destroy relationships and cause public humiliation? Sometimes the most necessary revelations come at the most painful moments when the truth can no longer be contained by the elaborate deceptions that have been created to protect us from consequences that ultimately prove less devastating than the ongoing burden of living lies that prevent authentic relationships and genuine happiness that can only exist when people know and accept each other completely, including the mistakes and circumstances that have shaped their character and choices throughout their lives.